Before we begin, there's something you need to know. A follower of the Turning Point noticed something in Nolan Wells' timeline that deserves a closer look. And if that detail means what some believe it could mean, we may have been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. Let's look at the alternative theory. And if you follow this alternative theory from beginning to end, it creates a completely different version of Nolan's final hours. Now, to be clear, this is not a confirmed timeline. It is a hypothetical reconstruction based on inconsistencies people believe they see in the public accounts. But listen carefully. According to Warren's version, the group was preparing to leave Horn Island. Some of Nolan's friends had already left. They were supposedly yelling for Nolan to get on the boat. And Nolan allegedly told them something like, "Go ahead, I'm going to meet up with Katie." So under Warren's version, Nolan willingly separates himself from the group. Simple enough. Except Warren later describes another scene. Now Nolan is already with Katie. Warren says Nolan was standing there holding or cradling her. And once again, the story becomes that they were yelling for Nolan to get on the boat. But Nolan supposedly wanted to stay. That creates an interesting question. Was Nolan refusing the boat before meeting Katie? Or was Nolan already with Katie when he supposedly refused to leave? Because those details matter. And then we get the account attributed to Katie. According to that version, Nolan did meet up with her. They talked for a short time. Katie was preparing to leave with the group she came with and go meet her parents. And Nolan reportedly told her that he was going back to his own friends, so he could get on the boat and head home too. Now stop. Because if Katie's recollection is accurate, Nolan did exactly what Warren originally said he planned to do. He went to meet Katie, he found Katie, they talked. And then Nolan allegedly said, "I'm going back to the guys." So why does the story end with Nolan choosing to remain on the island? That is where this alternative theory begins. Imagine Nolan leaves Katie and walks back toward his friends. Maybe they haven't left yet, maybe Nolan reaches them, and maybe Nolan actually does board one of the boats. Again, we do not know that happened. But hypothetically, if Nolan left Horn Island with the group, then the entire timeline changes, because now we would have to ask what happened after the boats returned to the mainland. And that is where the pool party allegations enter the story. There have been people online claiming that Nolan may have appeared later at a gathering connected to people from the group. Some have pointed to photographs, some have pointed to videos, some have described alleged confrontations involving Nolan's phone. And some versions of the theory become much darker, but none of those extreme claims have been publicly confirmed. So instead of saying they happened, ask what would have to be true if they did. First, Nolan would have needed to make it back from Horn Island. If he did, then the claim that he voluntarily remained behind would be wrong. Second, he would need to end up at or near the alleged gathering. If authenticated footage ever placed Nolan there after Horn Island, that would completely alter the accepted timeline. Because then the question would no longer be, what happened to Nolan after his friends left him? It would become, what happened to Nolan after he returned with them? And that is a very different investigation. Now, the followers' theory goes even further. It suggests there may have been tension surrounding Nolan's phone, that perhaps an argument occurred, that Nolan might have gotten into a confrontation with people present. Again, there is currently no basis to present those allegations as established fact. But hypothetically, if an argument happened after Nolan returned to the mainland, and if Nolan was injured during that confrontation, then anyone trying to explain his disappearance afterward would have an enormous problem. Because Nolan had already been seen leaving Horn Island, so how could Nolan later be found connected to Horn Island again? Under the followers' theory, this is where a second boat trip becomes part of the hypothetical scenario. Maybe a different boat was used. Maybe Nolan could have been transported again. Maybe the later marine activity had another purpose. But that is exactly where evidence becomes critical, because the GPS information discussed publicly for the distressed vessel does not appear to show that same boat simply returning to Horn Island later that night. So if the alternative theory is true, there would have to be another explanation, another vessel, another route, or another gap in the publicly known timeline. And that is the evidence investigators would need to establish. Now let's talk about the Ceto call. Some online theories treat the call as if it proves something criminal happened. It doesn't. The reported boat trouble could have been completely legitimate, but hypothetically, could a real mechanical problem also have created confusion? Absolutely. Could it have distracted people from establishing exactly where Nolan was? Possibly. Could somebody later use a real boat emergency to make the rest of the story sound more believable? That is also possible. Because these two statements are not the same. The boat had problems, and Nolan stayed behind. One can be true without the other, and this is where Brandon Tatum's interview becomes important. Because if Warren's version contained inconsistencies, Tatum had an opportunity to stop and reconstruct everything. When did Nolan first say he was going to Katie? When did Warren see Nolan with Katie? When did Nolan supposedly refuse the boat? Did Warren personally hear that refusal? Who else was present? What time was this? And most importantly, what happened after Nolan and Katie separated? Because if Katie's reported account is right, Nolan's next destination was not some unknown group. It was his own friends. Now take this alternative hypothesis all the way through. Maybe Nolan went back. Maybe he got on a boat. Maybe he reached the mainland. Maybe something happened later that nobody has publicly reconstructed correctly. And maybe the reason the story feels so confusing is because everyone keeps starting from Nolan stayed behind, instead of first proving that Nolan actually stayed behind. That does not mean Warren is lying. It does not mean the friends harmed Nolan. It does not mean the pool party allegations are true. It does not mean the Cito call was fake. And it certainly does not prove that anyone killed Nolan. But it leaves one question hanging over the entire case. If Nolan told Katie he was going back to his friends, what happened when he got there? Because if investigators ever established that Nolan did leave Horn Island that afternoon, then almost everything people currently believe about his final hours would have to be reconsidered. And maybe the real mystery is not what happened after Nolan stayed behind. Maybe the mystery is whether Nolan stayed behind at all.